I'm sure all of you know that Albert Parsons, the great American socialist fighter for the 8-hour day and one of the martyrs of the Haymarket riot, he began life as a Confederate soldier. So the ideal is that people can change. That's what I want. That's what I mean to assert. And this is an important part of the revolutionary tradition. And it, you know, we often summarize that tradition as a process of agitation, education, and organization. And the reason why we have education is that people can change. And this is one of the things that we do. It was Malcolm X who so many listened to, and he began as a criminal, you know, when you read his autobiography. My own studies, well, you mentioned the great peacenik and historian Edward Thompson. I was with him in 1971 in England at the time that the U.S. devalued and went off the gold standard, the first time that money freed itself from the commodity, we thought. And this was 1 week, or actually 2 weeks before George Jackson was murdered in a cold-blooded deed in San Quentin prison. And as a result of that murder, the Attica revolt took place at the maximum security penitentiary in New York State. Already by this time, Marxism was present in the movement. And that means it was present at Attica, where there was a third world study group of Puerto Rican, paddy dudes, or white people as they were called at that time, African Americans, that had been meeting for a year. And part of the language, the discourse at that time was Marxism. Though that Marxism was not the Marxism perhaps of Das Kapital or of serious students such as we are, of Althusser or Edward Thompson, because such people were not easily available throughout the movement. But what was available was some things like the Communist Manifesto or Stalin, partly because many Viet vets had come back, and of course the soldiers always interested in the enemy, and the enemy was communist, so the soldier would study communism, and so you would meet in prison convicts or prisoners who were Marxist. And I'm saying all of this because I taught at the University of Rochester, which academics know at that time for the, quote, Marxist academics who were there, such as Eugene Genovese, and there were others, I forget, or Christopher Lasch, or whatnot, or Herbert Gutman and History from Below. But the Marxists that meant the most to me were those at the Attica Penitentiary. And we formed a club, the L.D. Barclay Club, named for the spokesperson at Attica, who was assassinated by the pig Rockefeller in August 13th. Remember when 40 people were killed, the largest massacre in American history since the Indian massacres of the 19th century. This had a very big worldwide impact. One of the demands was a demand to go to a non-imperialist country and for the abolition of prisons. And these did not arise out of Das Kapital or Karl Marx. These arose from the movement, and people were thinking about the movement in relationship to what we were reading, and then what we were reading in relationship to the movement. This is for me, it was a birth and the origin of the London Hang. And Matt, what I wanted to do in the London Hang was to make a romantic statement. I wanted to say, because the London Hang begins with this liberation story of Jack Sheppard. And I wanted the political theorists and others to remember Blackstone. You know, I felt as a professor I needed to refer to the ruling class. And that William Blackstone was the ruler who influenced the American founding fathers. He was the lawman. He defined freedom as locomotion, the power, the ability to move from one place to another. And therefore I thought, who in the world, whose heart does not start beating when you read about an escape from prison? Whether it's in Colombia, whether it's a New York Times reporter escaping from a jail of the Taliban, or whether it's the Taliban escaping from the prisons of the Americans. You know, whether it's in Athens or whether it's in Port-au-Prince, whether it's in Attica or all over the world, this is a story of freedom that everyone understands. And so I wanted to begin this book in that way. And it was meant as a challenge, because here, and then the book subsequently moved to other themes that I'm ready to talk about, themes about the wage, because an essential characteristic of the Marx, as we understood Karl Marx, was the wage relationship. Karl Marx himself said he made three discoveries of significance, of originality. And these were the distinction between abstract and concrete labor, the fact that surplus value has three different forms: profit, interest, and rent, and finally the irrationality of the wage. In the academic disputes, in the worldwide disputes about what is Marxism, we thought, well, we should say, what did he say? And those were things that, I felt this was very necessary to study. Why is the wage irrational? It's irrational because it hides surplus value, unlike previous forms of exploitation, where working for the boss and working for yourself is separated, because the garden is over there and your garden's over here. Or on Mondays and Tuesdays you work for the seigneur, but on the other days you work for yourself. So that separation was very clear. Or in slavery you have none. Oh, but actually that's not even true. So the wage hides that under the pernicious slogan of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, or whatever it is. I mean, that's been pernicious, but it's also been powerful because it raises immediately the question of justice. What is fair? My work on this irrationality of the wage is that if it hides unpaid labor and paid labor, then the wage form is one in which the unpaid labor of housework, the unpaid labor of slavery, the unpaid labor even of study of the student is hidden in contrast to those who are waged. And this irrationality of the wage form applies not just to the individual in their working day, but also it applies to the labor market as a whole and how it's divided. So the London Hang, the bulk of the London Hang, is about the transition to that irrationality. And that transition is a process of criminalization of customary forms of income, until we get to chapter 10. And in chapter 10 describes another jailbreak. But now the jailbreak's not one individual, the jailbreak is a collective. Moreover, it's a motley collective, which means that it's led by African Americans, former slaves. This is on June 1780, the liberation of the prisoners of Newgate Prison. More than 500 were freed. Far more than were freed a few years later at the Bastille in 1789 in France. This is a much bigger jailbreak. Of course, the attack on the Bastille was not just to liberate the 7 prisoners there, but it was to obtain the arms that were inside. This wasn't the case in England.